January 3rd, 1804. Fog laid like damp wool over the lanes of Hammersmith, dimming every lantern into a trembling bead of honeyed light. The river behind the houses breathed quietly, pushing a tide against the banks with the patience of something that has all the time in the world. On nights like this, London felt narrowed to a single street, a single doorway, a single heartbeat that could stop at any moment. The wind made no promises, it only moved. And in that moving, people heard whispers. They thought of the figure that had been seen again and again, tall, white, silent. A shape without weight that stepped from the fog, reached, and took hold. Lock your doors, put on your headphones, because after this story, you'll never see a quiet street the same way again. It had begun months earlier, toward the end of 1803, when a cluster of tradesmen returning late to the west of London told the same unnerving tale. A spectre, they said, wandered the boundary of Hammersmith, along the hedgerows and narrow ways between churchyard and field. People described a white shroud hanging to the ground. They said it shone in moonlight. A miller swore its eyes glowed. A nursemaid, nearly losing her breath, insisted the apparition sprang from behind a wall the instant she passed it, caught her by the arm, and left the flesh cold as if bruised by winter. A wagoner claimed he saw it sit atop a milepost, motionless, watching the road as if it belonged to it. At first, Hammersmith did what London always did with rumour. It folded it into conversation. The spectre was a story to tell in taverns when the candles guttered low. But repetition does alchemy. What is repeated begins to feel like proof. By the second week, the rumour had its own rhythm. By the third, people spoke of it as a neighbour they wished would move away. Housewives crossing the road pulled their shawls close and quickened their steps, glancing from hedge to hedge. The men who worked late began carrying sticks. Those who had a pistol tucked it under a coat, behind a lid, into a drawer. The phrase, the Hammersmith ghost, took root, and once a name is given, a door is opened. Something is invited in. The city's edge was a country of its own in those days. Fields and market gardens touched rows of new houses. Lanes turned along old rights of way, where stones held memories of other cities that had existed before this one. The churchyard at St. Paul's gathered the dead near a road called Black Lion Lane, as if to remind the living that sidewalks have more than one layer. In that crossing place, between old and new, field and street, memory and need, a rumour grows quickly. It's watered by the fear people don't admit they carry. It feeds on footfalls and the distance between lamps. People said the ghost strangled. They said it wrapped cold arms around a person's chest and squeezed until prayer was the only word that would pass the lips. They said it jumped on the backs of men returning from drink and drove them to the ground, laughing without laughter. But most of all, they said it wore white. A clean, deliberate white that belonged to no living man at midnight. White like a winding sheet. White like work clothes bleached and hung out to dry. White like death makes men in their coffin. In another lifetime, perhaps, it would have remained a whisper. But fear is practical. Fear wants action. Men gathered and muttered that something had to be done. Not the watch, who came and went. Not the magistrates, who slept and rose and wrote orders. Ordinary men, shopkeepers and carpenters, an excise man, a cobbler, a handful of clerks whose fingers were used to ink, but who, in the hush of a winter night, wanted brass in their hands. Volunteers began to patrol the village, banded together by the single idea that the thing in white, whatever it was, whoever it was, could be confronted, could be caught, could be put down. Every city creates its own sentries. Hammersmith, on those nights, stepped into its own fancied uniform and marched a little braver than it felt. Fear loves a shape to focus on. It loves an answer that looks like a target. You might think that obvious, but history shows otherwise. It shows what happens when the shape is a blur and the aim is hurried by the colour of a coat, the tilt of a hat, the trick of a mist. In a house not far from the churchyard, a man kissed his wife on the forehead and stepped out after a long day's labour. The hour dragged toward midnight. The bricklayer. Some neighbours knew his name. Others called him simply the fellow in white. Wore what he always wore. A linen frock and trousers bleached by his trade. Clothes that marked him by day. Clothes that warned mortar and dust away from the rest of his life. But at night, in a fog, those same clothes became a costume no man would choose. His mother-in-law had warned him that people were jumpy, that fools with pistols were walking the lanes. She had told him to wear a dark greatcoat over his work clothes until the ghost business died. He had laughed. He had work again in the morning. He had a family and a bed and a need for sleep. He had a short walk that he'd made 100 times. He said he'd be fine. Elsewhere, another man had taken his position near Black Lion Lane. He had told his wife, or perhaps himself, that someone had to stand watch, that an example must be made. He was not the only one on the patrol. Others had taken up corners of the village in 2s and 3s. But there are nights when a man feels the company of others like a garment too heavy for the shoulders, when the courage to act seems to arrive only when no one is there to see you hesitate. He stood with a pistol loaded and ready. He watched the fog make and unmake the street. Listen closely. Nothing occult needs to happen for an ordinary street to become a trap. Fear is a carpenter. It measures the distance between a rumour and a trigger and finds the wooden nails the mind has left lying around. The figure appeared as the clock slid toward 1 in the morning. He came into the lane from a cut-through near the church. To the watching man, the shape was a shard of brightness in a grey world, white, head to foot. Tall because the fog exaggerated height like a mirror placed at an angle. The watching man called out. He demanded the figure halt. He said he would fire. Just here, history holds its breath. No ghost speaks, no curse falls. There is only a human voice in a winter lane. The white-clad figure replied. Words lost to time. A startle. Hands lifted or not. A step forward or not. Maybe he said his name. Maybe he said nothing at all and was turning to see if the address was meant for someone behind him. The guard fired. The crack of the shot slashed the fog. The man in white staggered, turned, and dropped into the wetness of the lane as if suddenly exhausted by the world. The mist held its silence around him. Footsteps came. Lanterns came. Faces appeared like moons, pale, flawed, astonished. The dead do not explain themselves. Those around him did the explaining instead. They said it was the ghost. No, it was not. It was a man, a local, a husband, a son-in-law. His name, spread quickly, was Thomas, and that name hit the village like a bell made of stone. Everything that followed was the working out of a single argument. What do we call a person when fear makes him shoot? Do we call him a protector who aimed at a monster and struck a neighbour by mistake? Do we call him a murderer whose bullet refuses the excuse of fog? Can a man be both? The village had to decide. Then London had to decide. Then the law itself had to decide how fear counts when weighed against a dead man's body. In the days that followed, people began the work of repairing a narrative. Neighbours stood in their doorways. and pretended they had always had doubts. The men who had patrolled the lanes with swagger now spoke softly as if in church. Women who had directed their children to the far side of the street at night returned their voices to ordinary volume. The Hammersmith Ghost was a story still, but its lines had been smudged by a gunpowder thumb. At the inquest, the man who had fired, Francis to some accounts, a volunteer guard to others, a private citizen who stepped into the uniform of a fear that the parish had itself sown, admitted he had believed the figure a ghost. He acknowledged what he'd done and perhaps hoped that belief softened the blow. There were witnesses who swore the dead man's white clothes would have scared anyone. A mother-in-law wept that she had begged him to wear a coat. Yet there were others, neighbours who had known him, who had known his roots, who had seen his shifts, who said the sentinel should have looked closer, should have called for help, should have held his fire, should, a word the law writes in ink, and the grieving write in blood. There is a peculiar coldness in the way official language meets loss. A coroner writes a name and a cause in an efficient hand. A magistrate schedules a hearing. A judge arrives with the grave calm of someone used to weighing the irreversible. The jury listens with the awkward silence of people asked to take a life without exactly touching it. The accused sits, hands folded, as if in a pew. But the prayers are thin and brittle, and no one trusts the God who seems to be listening. Onlookers crane their necks. A town gossip silences itself, not from respect, but because it suddenly has too much to feast on. When the jury returns, their words travel down the aisle like a draft. There was a guilty verdict. Not ghosts, not the fog, not an error no one could foresee. A human decision to aim and fire. The sentence, according to some tellings, was as severe as any the law could pass, softened later by the peculiar mercy that a monarch applies like a bandage after the amputation is complete. Officials decided that a fear of spirits does not make a man innocent when another is dead. They set a mark on the case all the same, a small asterisk in the margin to hint that perhaps the world could go wrong in ways the law had not prepared for. In time, other judges would look back at Hammersmith, at the crisp winter night, the white clothes, the weapon warmed by a hand, and they would ask themselves how a belief, a mistaken fervent belief, should matter when measured against a grave. But the law is only one narrative. Villages write their own. They wrote it in that slow, careful voice that communities use when trying to justify themselves to the future. It sounded like this. We were afraid. We meant well. It was dark. The figure was in white. He was warned. He kept walking. We did what we thought was right. And then, after the smallest of pauses, they added, we were wrong. For a time, the ghost receded. Not because anything supernatural had been captured, but because the village had paid the price rumor demanded. That is the bargain people make with fear again and again. Give it a story, give it a patrol, give it a bullet. Fear eats. It always eats. And when it's full, it sleeps. But Hammersmith is a place of returns. The river rounds its bend and comes back. The narrow lanes step away into new estates and then circle to the old churchyard like a thought that can't help itself. It is not strange that the ghost came back, not as a figure, but as a report. Months later, a man, older than the volunteers who had paced through fog, told a story that made the city wince. He said he had, on nights when mischief felt like a kind of power, wrapped himself in a white sheet and slipped out to frighten his apprentice, and then anyone else who happened to be walking late. He said he had done it until the village rose like a body shaken from sleep. He said he had stopped once the shooting set the air on fire, and everyone understood the cost of a laugh. If this confession was true, then the horror of Hammersmith becomes a mirror. The town made a ghost out of feeling, then made a man into a ghost with lead, while another living man had been the ghost some of the time, just as a prank, just as something to do because the lanes were dark and the evenings were long and people were easy to scare. It is a cruel geometry. It collapses circles into points and announces that everything was closer together than anyone cared to measure at the time. But the confession does not remove the weight of the earlier death. It does not clean a lane. It does not unteach a finger how little pressure a trigger needs. It does not take the white from a man's clothes. The ghost, whether cloth or rumour or superstition, had been fed. The village had fed it. Years pass and we pretend that neighbourhood memories work like candle smoke, thinning and drifting away until what happened is only faint scent. But the city stones carry time differently than we do. People walk across the same patch of road and never know what the road remembers. They stand in the same fog and think it is a fresh fog, when in fact the fog is an archivist, patient, meticulous, content to fold last night into tonight and file it under Hammersmith winter fear. Some say the ghost walked again, decades later, not in Hammersmith, but in other neighbourhoods, as if rumour had learned to travel by omnibus. It took on different names. It climbed different mileposts. It ran its fingers along hedges in other districts and waited for the first man to carry home a story in his pocket and offer it around at supper like bread. But the route remained the same. A doubt raised in the dark. A question asked too urgently. An answer that looked like a pistol. Hammersmith's case entered law books for one reason. It entered folklore for another. The books wanted to know the rule for killing when a man believes he is aiming at something that cannot die. The folklore wanted to know whether the village, in patrolling itself, had invited the very ghost it feared. Both are true in their spheres. Both point to the same sentence. Ordinary place. Familiar faces. But ordinary isn't safe. Consider now the nights of January when the river wears a breath you can see. The church bell marks the hour, and someone who never believed in anything half-seen walks faster between lamps, because tonight, perhaps, a prank becomes a panic, and a panic becomes a decision. Consider the way a colour can carry consequence. White is innocence, they say. White is surrender, they say. White is a bricklayer's coat, bleached and clean. White is a shroud. The same colour, two stories, one ending. There are details that linger like the taste of iron. An older woman who lamented that she'd begged him to cover up. A watcher who said he'd hailed the figure and received no answer. A judge whose words were as measured as beads on a rosary. A juror who tried to believe that a belief could be weighed properly. A village that found itself quieter than it had been in years, because good people had been made to speak softly in the presence of something they had chosen to wake. Details fit together to form a pattern that feels like prophecy when we look back and call it inevitable. But at the time, it was simply people. One tired man with white clothes heading home. One anxious man with a pistol waiting for a shape he feared would jump. There is a point when story and place fuse. The lanes of Hammersmith are not merely lanes. The churchyard is not just a yard. The white favourite of house painters and bricklayers is not only a colour. After the shooting, when someone tossed linen across a chair, it must have felt like casting a net into a river where something had drowned. People must have scanned hedgerows with a small, guilty hope that nothing moved. Children, sent to fetch water in the quiet ayups of morning, may have peered into fog and imagined the fog peered back. The ghost survives because it solves a problem. It gives a shape to the unease that a century carried in its pocket. The city was growing. Old lanes were becoming new streets. People were moving through each other's lives at speeds that felt indecent. Night built a second London atop the first, where faces looked different, and the things you took for granted by day, your walk, your work clothes, your safe passage, were transformed. A ghost is an admission that your eyes do not control the world after sunset. A patrol is the city's reply. We will make the night obey. But night has its own laws. It distorts, it muffles, it edits, and a pistol shape in the dark can be as persuasive as a doctrine. Picture the lane again, that thin arithmetic of hedge and road. The fog beads on the gun barrel. The man stiffens his arm, as if his bones could supply the certainty his thoughts lack. The other man's hands are up or down, or somewhere in the human middle that is hardest to interpret. A shout, a word, then the shot, echoing off brick, finding muscle, punching into absence. The sudden quiet afterward is the true ghost of Hammersmith. It still walks. Listen. They will tell you that lessons were learned. They will say that the law, peering into its own reflection, adjusted its wig and promised to consider belief more carefully in future cases. They will say that communities should not arm themselves against shadows, or if they do, they must at least agree on the shape of what they hunt. They will say that white cloth at midnight is to be avoided, that workers should not walk home wearing their trade, that children should not giggle too loudly about the brave men who go to catch ghosts, lest those men feel their valor is being auditioned. They will say much. But what is said when the city is bright and busy does not guarantee anything when fog falls again. There was a winter afterward when people spoke less of ghosts and more of wheat prices, more of treaties and taxes, more of the usual weights a house must carry. Memory is a muscle that fatigues. It falls quiet until someone, sometime, starts it working again. An anniversary, a new rumour, a man perhaps, in some modern year, wandering late, face lit by a little blue square of a phone, hearing footfalls behind him, turning because the past waits for nothing but the chance to recur. There is a temptation to finish the story with the courtroom, to close the book on the facts as written and say, here, the lesson ends. But it doesn't. The story ends where you stand in darkness and feel something assemble itself out of mist and distance and the small regular beat of your own fear. It ends, or rather, it cycles, when you, turning, wonder what you would do with a shape in white half seen. It cycles again when you glance at the nearest window and realize someone could be watching and that your decision will become another person's story tomorrow. Hammersmith exists to tell you that you are not immune to panic, that the mind tells itself fables of certainty at exactly the moment it has least right to be sure, that a foggy lane is not only foggy, it is layered. Beneath your shoes is a set of decisions made by others, and beneath those decisions are the names of the dead. A woman washing steps at dawn sees the mark where lantern oil spilled the night of the shooting. She scrubs, humming, pretending she does not know what she is washing away. A boy fishing bits of wood from the river pins one of the pieces with a stick to watch the current shove it sideways. Later he will remember the angle of that push when he thinks about how suddenly a man can drop. A pair of lovers, holding hands in the dark near the church. Step around a patch of ground with the reflex of locals, avoiding something they cannot name without changing the mood of the evening. These are the followers of the ghost, and they number everyone who lives in the place after a story like this takes hold. The white figure, whether born of cloth, rumour, or human cruelty, was an interruption. The shooting turned interruption into permanence. The law turned permanence into precedent, and the village turned precedent into folklore. That is the chain of custody. It is a chain heavy enough to sink anything attached to it if tossed into the river at the right bend. Some will ask for the ending that absolves. They want to hear that the man who fired spent a lifetime in remorse, and that remorse made the village gentler. They want to hear that the prankster who confessed was shamed until he understood that a laugh at night may become a sob by morning. They want to hear that the widow found consolation in a city newly vigilant about the kindness of recognizing one another in fog. They want a mercy they can stick in their pocket and touch for luck when the air goes white. But the truer ending is this. There are people in every age who feel safer when they can patrol their fear, who feel bolder when fear wears the uniform they can buy at a shop. They mean well, and sometimes meaning well is as dangerous as malice, because meaning well convinces you that the bullet is absolution in another form. In Hammersmith, fear asked to be fed and received the price it demanded. The village learned to pronounce the syllables of regret. It did not unlearn the impulse that made it army self. That lesson would take generations, and even then, it would be a lesson that had to be learned anew every time a city had a dark corner, which is to say, every night. There is one more image to hold in view before the fog closes again. A roll of white fabric on a workbench at midday. The room is bright. The cloth is innocent. A hand rests on it, thinking of nothing but function. Cut. Seam. The hand does not know that later, another hand will touch cloth in the dark with a different thought entirely. The daytime world and the nighttime world share material. The difference is intent. The difference is what we convince ourselves we see when the light drops. On January 3rd, 1804, a man in Hammersmith was mistaken for a ghost. He died because he was the right colour at the wrong hour, and because another man carried both fear and the means to make that fear matter. This single sentence contains the kind of horror that needs no haunted house, no cursed object, no bargain with anything infernal. It is the horror of being transformed by another's belief, and of learning, too late, that belief can be lethal. So, lock your doors. Put on your headphones. Listen to the quiet when the river breathes, and the fog fills every space between. And remember that the scariest figure in white is not the apparition in the hedgerow. It is the blank of certainty that fills a mind moments before a decision it cannot take back. The ghost of Hammersmith walks because every city, every age, every winter night gives it a new pair of shoes. It walks because we let it. It walks because we are afraid. And in our fear, we think we know what we see. But maybe it wasn't a ghost. Maybe it was a man. An ordinary man heading home in the clothes that bought bread for his table. Maybe the shape in the fog is, 9 times out of 10, a neighbour. Maybe the 10th time matters less than the 9 you will never be able to live with if you get it wrong. That is the dread that lingers after this story is told. Not the spectre in white. Not really. The dread is your reflection in a dark window. The part of you that believes a rumour might be real and that acting fast is safer than living with doubt. Until you understand that doubt is a life And certainty sometimes is a sentence. Walk the lanes of Hammersmith in your mind one last time. The hedges whisper nothing. The stones are cool beneath your shoes. The churchyard is to your right, the river to your left. There is no one else until there is. A figure approaches, pale, arm lifted slightly as if to shield eyes from a lantern's glare. Your breath threads out into the air in front of you like a small ghost of its own. The heart drums. The mind writes quickly. The hand, if it is holding anything, must decide. The story has always been asking the same question. It asks it now, to you. If fear were a person, and it stood one pace away in the fog wearing the wrong colour at the wrong time, would you know it for what it is? Or would you, like Hammersmith, like the guard in the lane, like a city that loves its rumours, give that fear a body, give it a gun, and call the result justice? Remember this. Let it haunt the good sense you carry home at night, because after Hammersmith, after the winter of 1803, and the shot in the first days of 1804, the most faithful ghost to walk London wasn't draped in a winding sheet. It was draped in certainty. And certainty, once awakened, is very hard to put back to sleep.